As Christina asked you to talk about happiness, you could probably notice how the atmosphere in the room is changing immediately. And that's one of the nice things when you do research about happiness. Like everybody has something to say about it. And it brings a kind of positive atmosphere. And at the same time, it's very difficult to grasp. Like, what is happiness? There's many different ideas and so on. As she said, I'm a political scientist, so this PhD work is based in political sciences, which means I'm not a psychologist. So I'm not going to give you the answer, what is happiness, and how happiness works, and how you can become the most happy person in the world. I pick on some psychological knowledge, but a bit more on ideas about happiness in the philosophical way, and also look a bit into social sciences and the philosophical way. Maybe 2 or 3 words how I came up with this topic. As was mentioned, I mainly work in education, or used to work in education, trying to get young people motivated for sustainability issues and so on. And at some point you always come to the question like, yeah, but does that mean we are not allowed to consume anymore? And isn't that a boring life if we are all like sustainable and ecologically conscious and so on? And so I came up with this question, well, actually, true, we aim for happiness, and if happiness does not go with sustainability, we do have a problem. So let's look into that. And then, yeah, the next 6 years I spent doing a PhD and so on. I'm not sure I found the big answer, but I still think the question is quite interesting. Because the lifestyle we are pursuing globally nowadays, it used to be in the highly industrialized West, but it's the role model now in the whole world, is not sustainable as we know, as we are aware of. This is one picture which is giving you one idea of it. It shows you the level of life satisfaction people in Germany reported over the years, and the level of the gross domestic product. And you can see there's somehow it's not following the same direction. Which in a way, life satisfaction is being reported between 0 and 10, so it cannot grow indefinitely. While the GDP can grow, also not indefinitely, but at least kind of constantly. But as you can see, this increased by 40% from the 1980s to more or less nowadays. And apparently people did not become more satisfied with their life. And you find similar graphs for pretty much all of the West European and Central European countries. And this, I think, is an interesting starting point to ask ourselves, is the additional wealth we are producing actually contributing to the well-being we are experiencing? And if I talk about well-being, it's always the kind of the mix of happiness and life satisfaction. If you look into like happiness studies, they kind of differentiate between happiness as a state you are in right now, like the body giving you signal, everything is fine, I'm good, because I have enough food, I slept well, I have friends around me, whatever. And then the other thing is like life satisfaction. Am I actually satisfied with life? So this includes ideas about life I have, about what is a good life and so on. Because we all know we have moments of unhappiness, but they might contribute to a good life. Like doing unpleasant things, so on, starting from going to the dentist, as my colleague did just yesterday, or maybe learning for an exam and it's really tiring, but we know we want to do this exam because it's part of bigger goals we have in life. So that's why they use the term subjective well-being, which includes both, like moments of happiness, but also ideas of the good life. And this is a bit more about overall life satisfaction, but nevertheless, I think it gives an interesting impression where we are at. And this, of course, the GDP is pretty directly linked to the amount of consumption, production, and also pollution we are having in these societies. And economies. As we are aware, this is not sustainable. And I'm not sure you're familiar with the idea of the planetary boundaries in sustainability science. This has been one of the leading models for the almost last 10 years. It's like kind of the outer circle, and it tells us there's like 9 big categories where you can more or less precisely say there's planetary boundaries, and 3 of them, which is climate change on the top, which is biodiversity loss on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, are at the moment way beyond the boundaries. So the way, I say mankind in a big way, is kind of running the planet is not sustainable. Climate change is maybe the most familiar to us through media discussion and so on, and more recently through the weather we're experiencing in the hot and dry summer. So there's something happening which is not sustainable, and sustainable really in the classic sense of like not using more resources and not polluting the planet more than can be done in the long run, so that we have a good life and future generations have a good life. Which is interesting in this model, the so-called donut economy, the British economists called it. It's like the green thingy. She says, well, this is the safe and just space, and it looks like a donut, because whenever we as humans live and have a culture and civilization, we do need resources. We do produce something, we consume something, so there's a minimum level of pollution, so to say, and this is what she calls the inner dark green circle, the social foundation of human life. So it's not really a goal to say we don't consume anything and so on, because then we probably should just not exist. And this might not be a very logical goal for human beings. So the question is, how can we achieve a good life without endangering the good life for future generations, or actually, if we look at younger people, for our own lives in like 30 or 40 years, as for example Greta Thunberg, who's at the moment very popular, always like tries to make the point. It's not about future generations, it's about herself in 50 years' time. So this is kind of the core question. So how much do we need for a good life which is sustainable? And therefore I would say this question of is wealth actually linked to well-being, and if yes, to which extent, is very crucial for sustainable development and questions about sustainability. Because there's one thing about doing like particular environmental sciences and techniques and so on, like how to protect, I don't know, waters, air and forests, but the overarching question for humanity really is, how do we design our lives and organize our lives in a way that is sustainable in so many detailed ways. And I found this one comic which is maybe telling something where he says, shit, I'm still not happy. So apparently we're following a certain idea about what should be the good life, which is not sustainable, but apparently also not bringing the biggest possible happiness. That is the question, which is not so easy to answer. I mainly looked in my research at countries like Germany, so highly industrialized Western economies. And what we find there is that there has been a prediction since many years that we are actually producing more than we need. And we could actually produce what we need with like half the working time and spend the rest of the time relaxing, enjoying, having fun, probably engaging in some of the things which you just discussed being important for happiness. And in social sciences, you have various models. One I found quite striking is from a Swiss sociologist who calls it the thread mills of happiness. So kind of we are caught in a certain pattern and keep following it, although we are not really advancing. And he names 3 of them. One is the status, the innovation, and the acceleration. So we always look at like what has a neighbor got, and we need to have at least the same or more. We always have new things, and the whole circle is also getting faster and faster. Think about technological innovations, for example. New cell phone every 2 years at least, or every year, to be like on the level of what is good and what gives you an idea of participating in the consumer society. So this is quite interesting, and it leads to something which is a permanent state of like kind of exhaustion or tiredness. In Germany, for example, if you look at reports from health insurances, they have like research departments, and they ask people, how are you in life, how are you doing, how's your job, and so on. 50% of people being asked say, well, I often experience stress in my job and I'm really tired in my life. 30% say, after work, I'm so exhausted I can't do anything useful anymore in my life. So they watch television or whatever. Which is interesting. I mean, Germany is one of the richest countries in the world, and it spends a lot of its energy just working. And many people then afterwards are just tired. So apparently we are trapped in a certain pattern that tells us work is very important, producing is very important, and consumption is very important. And we have lost a bit the ability to ask ourselves, how important is that in a bigger picture of the good life? Or are we just following certain historical values and patterns? And you could, of course, trace this back to modernity, to Protestant work ethics, and so on. This would be the big arch, which I cannot really follow here in detail, but I just want to give this, this picture of a kind of paradox situation, or some people actually call it almost pathological, that we as society are having the idea of a good life, but apparently the way we are achieving it does not lead to a good life as it could. So now the question is, what would be alternatives? Like this is kind of the diagnosis of what's the problem and how could the idea of a good life and well-being be linked. And then what would be alternatives to this? And there's like main 3 approaches. I try to make it a bit simplified here. On the one hand, left-hand side, you see eco-technology. So we just need more technology, and then these things will be solved. Yeah, we will have better technology, so we have more time, and we need less resources, and so on. This is kind of the mainstream answer at the moment, where the economy tells us, don't worry, we will sort it out. So far, it's not very likely that this will really work. At least if we look into the past, technology has not really supplied the best answers and solutions to it. And also it's always a question of how do we use technology. And in terms of growth and degrowth, the limits of growth, we find one phenomenon which is called the rebound effect, that we have more modern technology, which for example uses less resources, but at the same time we have more technology, or bigger technology. Think about the refrigerator, which is now using less energy than 20 years ago, but I bet at home your refrigerators are much bigger than the one 20 years ago. And so in the end we come out with new refrigerators, but the same amount of energy we use. So this is like a problem of the technology cycle if we don't as well ask how much technology do we really need. Or if we use the cars and fuel them with electricity, it's nice, but the cars still need to be produced. They still occupy a lot of space in the city and so on. So technology is part of the solution, but not the solution. On the very opposite, the right-hand side, is something which I would label here a kind of ecological, spiritual approach, which in Germany, amongst certain ecological people at the moment, is very favorable, linked to indigenous movements from other parts of the world, like the Buen Vivir idea of South America. And it says something, we have to go back to nature and connect to nature and the real original equilibrium, mankind and nature, which sounds very nice, and for example in Germany it's linked a lot to ideas of like romanticism and so on. But if you look at it in detail, it's a bit tricky, because on a philosophical level and also on an empirical historical level, you don't really find this point of where man and nature lived in harmony. And a lot of modern life and the comfort we have from, for example, medical technology or universities and educational systems, or the use of communication technology, does not really easily comply with this idea of a holistic indigenous world. I mean, who really would like to live as people lived 100 years ago? Probably most people not. So this is an idea, and it's nice if some people move back to the villages and live like a very nature-connected life. But for society as a whole, I don't really see it as a working model. So in between is something which I find interesting, and it's a kind of the question of, what is the good life and what is reflected hedonism, or you could also say enlightened hedonism, enlightenment in terms of like Immanuel Kant and the Enlightenment, so not the Buddha enlightenment, but the kind of reflected enlightenment, which is asking how do we want to relate to nature. And it's not just derived from traditional means, but in a kind of we decide ourselves, and we also decide ourselves how do we use technology and so on. And maybe we decide ourselves that we could enjoy life a little more and overcome some of these treadmills of being super busy all the time. And this would mean developing a bit further ideas of culture, society, and so on, or what can also be called the art of living. Philosophy about the art of living is actually going back to the old Greek philosophers who said, well, you have to find out yourself, you should not just follow one school, but just, do starting from everyday exercises and find out what is good for you, to philosophical striving and see what is a just and good life for yourself. And by this, I would say it connects a lot to modern society. The idea of art of living has been picked up again by Michel Foucault, who you might be familiar with, a French philosopher, and it's quite interesting, I think. It also, in some ways, relates to hedonism, and hedonism also in the traditional sense. So not in the sense as we sometimes understand it, like go for as much as you can, like it's connected very often to consumer society, the hedonic thing, like just get the immediate reward. But if you look into it, into the philosophy, it's actually a more reflected idea, which is really asking not how can I have fun in the moment, but how can I have a good life and a happy life. And that often means I try not to have fun in the moment and try not to indulge in the nearest pleasurable activity, but to find for myself a state of awareness and being and enjoyment, which is like, more long arching. And here I just give a few examples to show how broad the scope is. One is, of course, engaging in, for example, ecological activities like gardening and so on, which is certainly a sustainable lifestyle. But I would also include cultural activities like dancing or playing music, or I don't know how to skateboard, but I think it's an interesting example, because if we think about skateboards, we don't really think about nature and so on. We see it as city and concrete, and but if we look at it on a second thought, it's an activity that does not require a lot of resources, and it's a mode of transport which does not emit a lot of CO2. So it's like a kind of indirect, sustainable way of spending time and developing yourself. So to broaden this idea of what are sustainable practices, that's more or less what I find interesting to discuss. to have not just directly sustainable practices like engaging in community gardening and so on, so kind of all the things that jump out of this idea of having more and going faster and so on, but go more into what is personal development, which is out of the consumer production cycle, and therefore bring like an indirect contribution to the idea of sustainability in terms of sufficiency and so on. That to me is interesting to debate. One aspect I want to shortly focus on, or just have a little thing, is nature and happiness, because I know here in the department it's a lot about natural conservation and these questions, and this is also linked quite a lot to happiness, because there's a number of empirical studies that show that people that are connected to nature have higher levels of health and higher levels of happiness. There's one famous study which looked at people being in a hospital, and if from the room where they are out of the window they can look at a tree, they are quicker to recover as people that out of the window look to a wall and don't see any green tree, which is interesting. So it shows like, well, okay, we are like environmental beings, and apparently seeing healthy environment also helps us to recover in a way. Another study was in Great Britain conducted, and they found out that people that go for a walk to nature, and if it's only 10 minutes a day, have already a higher level of health and well-being. And they suggested to not just have the National Health Service, as it's called in the UK, but also the Natural Health Service. So if you think about nature, protecting nature and the environment, it's not just for nature's sake, but it also contributes essentially to the well-being of people that are able to experience this nature and connect to nature. Nevertheless, just having nature as happiness does not mean that, well, okay, then we already have the perfect sustainability lifestyle. You know, you just go to nature and enjoy nature. That would be a bit too easy. Because nature makes people happy and healthy, but there are also examples that it does not automatically lead to a sustainable lifestyle. Think, for example, about tourism, or also the question of settlements. I'll give you the example in Germany. One of the problems we are having is that people from the city want to move to the outskirts of the city to be closer to nature. But by this, it means they're kind of, destroying nature, because the settlements, urban sprawling is happening. And at the same time, they commute to work in the city center, so kind of they enjoy nature, that's why they move outside, and at the same time, their lifestyle becomes less sustainable. It's a problem. The other thing is in tourism. I mean, either in the big scope, people traveling to the end of the world because they want to enjoy beautiful nature, or even in the smaller scope. The German Alpine Club, Alpenverein, made a survey about people going for a daily hike. So they go to the German Alps because they enjoy the beautiful nature, and they found out that more than 40% took the car and traveled more than 100 kilometers to go hiking and 100 kilometers back. Which means, well, they enjoy nature and they want to do something for nature, but at the same time, it does not automatically bring a lifestyle which is sustainable. So that's something interesting which definitely needs more research and questions for daily practices. In Germany, generally, we can find people with the highest values for sustainability and so on do really not have a sustainable lifestyle, which is quite interesting and is bothering a lot of environmental researchers, how this can happen and how this can be tackled. And I would say one of the possibilities is to make nature more accessible, which means you do not have to travel to experience beautiful nature. And it means also maybe your way of experiencing nature as beauty and as recreational could change. And this goes a bit back to this art of living approach. You know, if you on your own become maybe more open, more sensible, more interested and curious, you might just go to the next park or the backyard of this university and also find already beautiful nature to enjoy and you don't have to travel to the next national park to enjoy beautiful nature. So this could be an interesting question, and also linked to gardening and so on. So the idea here, not just to enjoy things that we know, but while enjoying it, also becoming more, how can you say, better experts in enjoying life. You know, like if you're playing music, after a few years, your awareness of music, your skills have really developed, and the same is with all your experiences in nature or other things. So this idea of art of living, I find very interesting for happiness. This I want to link now to the idea of education, because now we are set up in an educational project, and I think it means education also needs to broaden its understanding of how to promote sustainable lifestyles and sustainable action and environmental protection and so on. At the moment, the maybe leading model is education for sustainable development, which is more than just environmental education. Yeah? Maybe there on top you can see kids going to the water, exploring the water, making small chemical analysis and so on. So they learn about biology and the environment, which is a very, very important starting point for them. But education for sustainable development also includes society and economic issues. As you can see there on the second picture, learning about, for example, how does McDonald's function, where does our food come from, how is that linked to environmental issues, and so on. And it's connected in this idea of the so-called shaping skills, in German, Gestaltungskompetenz. German language is very good in like building these strange words, which means kids, young people, but also adults should not just get knowledge and experiences, but they should also get skills to interact in society and, or here as I put it in a bit big words, create a more sustainable world, you know? So how to motivate themselves, how to motivate others to take action. And on the picture below you can see, for example, one activity which is people having a picnic in the middle of a crossroads, and by this like talking about traffic problems and so on in big cities. So this is something where education has been developing already, and from my research and my topic, I would argue maybe education should also include more aspects of well-being. You know, how can I create for myself a good life? What are the values that I'm following? And what do I think would be a good life in 10 years' time? It's quite interesting if you look at happiness and education. We find out that very often it's not a topic in formal education. In schools, we don't learn a lot about happiness. We learn something about happiness in our families, more or less. But I don't know, my parents, I'm not sure they were experts for happiness. At least, I mean, they gave me some values and they gave me some ideas of what a good life could be, but I'm not sure they were very happy, and I'm not sure I really learned a lot about happiness. So this is a bit left to the private sphere to figure out. And in our lives nowadays, which means we look at media, we look at commercials and so on, so this is influenced a lot by this agents. And therefore I think it would be good if in education we would make it a bigger topic, which does not mean that school should tell us what happiness is, but should give us space to actually discuss and explore what is happiness, what is a good life, how do we want to live, and maybe also give us space to try out things. And I think all connections to arts, culture, music and so on are also important. I'm not totally familiar with the Bulgarian curriculum, but I know in Germany, for example, and also in other European, Western European countries, all the sciences have been promoted a lot during the last years, and if one of the school subjects is like being cancelled, it's either first music or arts or sports, because this is like the add-on, it's a fun thing. but it's not. It's the most essential thing to figure out, you know, what is interesting in life, who am I? Okay, I can become a chemical engineer or an accountant or whatsoever, but a good life needs other skills. And this is something which I think should be, more discussed again. So as a very last point now, we had the idea of sustainability and the good life, questioning a bit the role models we are pursuing, and looked at education. And one of the activities we are envisioning in this project is some kind of garden installations that give ideas about gardening, about urban gardening, and brings us to different city spaces. And I just think it's a very interesting idea because it could stir discussions and reflections and so on. This summer I saw it in two places. Right-hand side is Hanover, a city in Germany, where there has been the small installation style in front of the main railway station actually. On the left-hand side we see it in Warsaw, Poland. And I think it's nice because it can tell you something. I mean, you see plants, you see information boards, and you can also see places to sit, relax, and chat. And this combination I find very nice because it tells you something about ecological issues, about the importance of gardening, about the importance of food, and so on. Depends, of course, what you put in a garden. It doesn't need to be just beautiful decoration. It can also be herbs and plants and fruits. It invites people to be involved in this gardening project by maintaining it straight away or referring to other gardening projects. And I think it also inspires thoughts about how do we want to design the central places. Does it need to be all traffic and shopping in the city center? Or can it be something else? Can it be something that we actually build and design the way we want to have it? And maybe invite also cultural activities and so on. To me, also discussing gardening is very interesting in terms of values. When I travel, I realize that, for example, in Germany, during the last 10 years, gardens suddenly became popular again. You know, it's like, wow, if you have a garden, that's a luxury. And people go like, nice, if you grow your own food in Berlin, you are like the coolest person at all. If you go to the supermarket, well. When I travel and talk to people in Poland, for example, and also here in Bulgaria, sometimes they say, well, we have gardens, and it's partially because of tradition, but partially because of economic things, you know. It would be nicer to buy food in the supermarket, but difficult, so we have the garden. So the idea of gardening might not have a very high value sometimes. And in my view, this is like, wow, this should change quickly. And it's something what we could learn a lot, you know. Gardening, I think, seems to me be still more implemented in daily life in many countries in like Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and so on. And that's something where countries like Germany can learn a lot from, and could also encourage people to remain all these skills, gardening skills, and this culture of having it as part of production and consumption. And I think this could be one of the things. By this I try to give a brief, big scope of my PhD, which is hopefully soon to be published next spring in German, unfortunately, and 300 pages, so maybe not so easy to read. But I'll be happy to have a little discussion with you or questions, and otherwise be happy to come once again and dig deeper on one of the specific aspects. I try to not give too many details and data now, but more a bit the overarching view and idea why I think happiness is one of the crucial aspects if we talk about environmental issues and especially sustainable lifestyles. And for a discussion picture, this is a picture by Matisse, the Bonheur, the good life, which also looks quite sustainable but quite joyful, I would say. So I thought maybe that's a nice background picture. Thank you very much. Merci.